in the dusty border town of Hollow Creek, where the wind always seemed to carry whispers of other people's business, and the sun bleached even hope into a pale imitation of itself. Everyone knew that Thomas Hale was being forced into a marriage he did not want, and everyone knew that the woman he was being forced to marry was Eleanor Gray. The town's so-called old maid, though she was only 30, an age the town had already judged and discarded her for, as if time itself were a crime when worn by a woman with quiet eyes and a soft voice. And Thomas hated the word, almost as much as he hated the looks people gave him when they said it, because Thomas Hale had been raised to be honorable, stubbornly so, but he had also been raised poor, and poverty was a rope that could tighten around a man's choices until even honor struggled to breathe. And that was how he found himself, sitting stiffly in the narrow, wooden pew of the small white church on the edge of town, hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white, staring forward at the altar as if it were a gallows, while behind him the town gathered not in celebration but in judgment, in curiosity, in thinly veiled amusement, whispering that he could have done better, whispering that he had no choice, whispering that Eleanor Gray was lucky, whispering that Thomas Hale was foolish, whispering everything except kindness, and Eleanor, seated a few rows ahead with her hands folded in her lap, heard none of it because she had learned long ago how to go somewhere quiet inside herself when the world became too loud, how to breathe through the ache of being seen but not known. And if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed that her hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of hope she did not dare to trust, because hope had betrayed her before, when she was younger and prettier and believed that love would come if she was patient and good and kind. But love had passed her by as men chose, girls with brighter laughter and softer skin and futures. That did not include caring for a sick mother, and then her mother had died, and Eleanor had been left with a small house, a seamstress's income, and a reputation as a woman who waited too long. And when Thomas's uncle had approached her with the offer, the bargain really, of marriage in exchange for the forgiveness of Thomas's debts, she had felt something crack open inside her. Not joy exactly, but relief. Relief at not having to be alone forever. Relief at being chosen at all, even if the choosing was born of necessity rather than desire. And she had said yes, because saying no felt like stepping back into the shadow she had lived in for too many years already. And now here she was, about to become a wife to a man who did not love her. And she told herself that love was not required, that companionship was enough, that kindness could be built, that perhaps in time, Thomas would see her not as a burden or a solution, but as a person. And Thomas, standing now as the minister called his name, did see her, really saw her for the first time in a way that surprised him, because when she turned to face him, her eyes were not dull or defeated as he had imagined, but steady and warm and unafraid. And there was something in that steadiness that unsettled him more than any anger could have, because it made him feel seen too, seen in his resentment, his fear, his pride, his sense of failure. And as he took his place beside her and repeated the vows with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, he felt a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. Guilt because she deserved more than a forced promise, gratitude because she was offering him grace without asking for it. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and the town offered a thin, polite applause, Thomas did something no one expected, including himself. He turned slightly toward Eleanor and said quietly, so only she could hear, "I'm sorry," and Eleanor's eyes softened, not with sadness but with understanding, and she replied just as quietly, "We'll be all right." And Thomas did not know why that simple sentence unsettled him more than the vows, but it did, because it implied a future he had not allowed himself to imagine. And so the marriage began not with romance or celebration, but with a long, awkward carriage ride to the small farmhouse Thomas had inherited, the horses' hooves dull against the dirt road, the silence between them thick and uncertain, Thomas staring out at the fields, Eleanor staring at her folded hands, both wondering how two strangers were supposed to build a life from nothing but obligation. And when they arrived, Thomas carried her small trunk inside without a word, and Eleanor thanked him softly, and he nodded, and that was all. And that night they slept in separate rooms, because neither knew how to cross the space between them, physical or emotional. And Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling like a man who had failed at every promise he had ever made to himself, while Eleanor lay awake staring at the window, feeling like a woman who had finally stepped into a future, even if it was not the one she had dreamed of. And neither of them knew that this quiet beginning, this uncomfortable, unromantic start, was not the story's end, but its first trembling step. The moment when two wounded lives brushed against each other, not with fire but with gentleness, and gentleness, though no one in Hollow Creek would have believed it, was stronger than fire in the end. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded like a careful negotiation between two people who did not yet know the rules of each other's hearts. Thomas rising before dawn to work the fields and tend the animals, Eleanor waking shortly after to prepare simple meals, mend torn clothes, sweep floors that did not really need sweeping, both of them moving through the small farmhouse like respectful guests rather than partners, careful not to intrude, careful not to ask too much, careful not to expose the parts of themselves that felt too fragile to risk being misunderstood. And in that carefulness, something tender began to form without either of them noticing at first, because Thomas noticed that his shirts came back cleaner than before, mended more carefully than his mother ever had, and Eleanor noticed that Thomas always made sure there was enough firewood by the door so she would not have to carry heavy logs in the cold. And these were not grand gestures, but small acts of attention, the kind that slipped quietly into the space between them and made it warmer, without announcing themselves. And over time, their silences changed from awkward to comfortable, from something that had to be endured into something that could be shared. The quiet of two people sitting on the same porch in the evening watching the sun drop behind the hills. The quiet of shared meals where they no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words, and yet beneath that quiet both of them carried fears they did not voice. Thomas afraid that Eleanor would grow to resent him for marrying her without love. Eleanor afraid that Thomas would never truly see her as more than an obligation. And so they orbited each other gently, close but not quite touching, like two stars afraid of burning each other if they drew too near. And then one evening, when the sky was heavy with rain and the air felt thick and restless, something shifted, because Thomas came home later than usual with a cut on his hand. Nothing serious, just a deep slice from a rusted tool, but Eleanor saw the blood and her face went pale, and she took his hand without asking, guiding him to the table, cleaning the wound with water that stung and made him flinch, wrapping it carefully with a clean cloth, her fingers gentle but firm, and Thomas watched her face as she worked, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips pressed together as if she were holding back words she did not want to release too quickly, and he felt a strange tightening in his chest. Not pain, but something warmer, something dangerously close to gratitude that felt too deep for its own safety. And when she finished, she looked up at him and said softly, "You should be more careful." And there was no scolding in her voice, only concern. And Thomas found himself saying something he had not planned to say. "I'm not very good at being looked after." And Eleanor paused, her fingers still resting lightly on his hand, and replied, "I am." And something in the simplicity of that exchange broke a small wall inside him, a wall he had built long ago to keep himself from needing anyone. And from that night forward, he began to let her see more of him. His tiredness, his frustrations, the way the debt still weighed on him like a shadow, the way he feared he would never be enough. And Eleanor listened not as a judge, but as a witness, offering not solutions but presence. And in return, she began to let him see her too. The loneliness she had carried before him, the quiet shame the town had placed on her shoulders, the fear that she was always arriving too late to her own life. And Thomas listened, and he did not try to fix her. He did not dismiss her pain. He simply held it with her, and that, to Eleanor, felt more intimate than any kiss she had ever imagined. And so their relationship deepened not through passion, but through trust, through shared vulnerability, through the slow realization that neither of them had to be strong alone anymore. And one evening, months after the wedding, they found themselves laughing together over a simple mistake. Thomas had made with the bread dough, flour scattered across the kitchen like snow, Eleanor trying not to laugh, Thomas laughing at himself, and the sound of it startled them both because it felt new and light and unburdened, and Thomas realized then that he liked making her laugh, that it gave him a sense of purpose he had not felt in a long time, and Eleanor realized that she felt safe with him, a safety that went beyond physical protection into something deeper. something that allowed her to be fully herself without apology, and yet still neither of them named what was growing between them, because naming it felt like risking it, and risk was something both of them had learned to fear. And so they continued on in this quiet dance of closeness and caution, until one winter night when a storm hit the farmhouse with sudden violence. The wind howling, the windows rattling, the roof groaning under the weight of snow, and Eleanor woke in fear, her heart racing, memories of past storms and loss rushing back, and without thinking she went to Thomas's room and knocked. And he opened the door instantly as if he had been awake already, and when he saw her face he stepped aside without a word, and she sat on the edge of his bed while the storm raged outside, and he sat beside her close but not touching, until she leaned slightly into him, just enough that their shoulders brushed, and Thomas felt that brush like a current, gentle but powerful, and he did not pull away, and Eleanor did not pull back, and they stayed like that, sharing warmth, sharing fear, sharing presence until the storm passed, and in that quiet after the storm, Thomas realized that he no longer thought of Eleanor as a burden or a solution or an obligation, but as his companion, his partner, his quiet harbor in a world that had never offered him one before. And Eleanor realized that she no longer felt chosen out of necessity, but chosen every day in small ways that mattered more than grand declarations ever could. And though neither of them spoke the word love, it had begun to live between them, unannounced but undeniable, growing in the spaces where loneliness once had been, turning absence into belonging, turning two separate lives into something shared and alive. By the time spring reached Hollow Creek, softening the hard edges of winter, and pulling green from the reluctant earth, Thomas and Eleanor's life together had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt natural in a way neither had expected. Mornings filled with shared work, evenings filled with shared silence, the kind that felt companionable rather than empty, and it was precisely when their world had begun to feel safe that the outside world decided to remind them it could still hurt. Because rumors have a way of surviving longer than winters do, and Hollow Creek had not forgotten that Eleanor was the woman no one had chosen until Thomas had been forced to, and it had not forgiven Thomas for breaking the invisible rules of the town by finding happiness where the town had predicted none would exist. And so the looks began again, the whispers, the sideways comments at the market, the thin smiles that did not reach people's eyes, and Eleanor noticed them first, not because they were new, but because now she had something to lose, a life she loved, a marriage she cherished, a sense of belonging she had waited years for, and she began to pull inward, to grow quieter, to move through town with her eyes lowered again as she once had, and Thomas noticed, and it angered him in a way that surprised him, not because the town judged him, he was used to that, but because the town dared to make Eleanor feel small again after she had finally begun to bloom. And one afternoon when a woman at the market laughed quietly and said, "I suppose anyone looks beautiful when there's no other choice," Thomas turned with a sharpness in his voice that made the market go still and said, "She was always beautiful. You just weren't looking." And Eleanor felt something break open inside her at those words. Not pride, but relief. Relief at being defended, at being seen, at being claimed not as property but as value. And yet even that defense could not fully shield her from the slow erosion of cruelty, and the town's judgments began to seep into her thoughts, whispering that she was a compromise, that she was temporary, that Thomas would someday regret her. And those whispers became loud enough that she began to believe them, and she started to create distance again, not physically but emotionally, holding back laughter, holding back warmth, as if by making herself smaller, she could make the eventual loss hurt less. And Thomas felt that distance and did not understand it. And misunderstanding is fertile ground for fear, and he began to worry that he had misread her feelings, that perhaps she was unhappy, that perhaps she felt trapped as he once had, and so both of them began to suffer in silence, each trying to protect the other from pain by withholding the very closeness that could have healed it. Until the day Thomas came home early and heard Eleanor crying in the kitchen, not loud sobs but the quiet, broken kind that sounded like a heart trying not to be heard, and he stood frozen for a moment listening, feeling like he was trespassing on something private and sacred, and then he stepped inside and Eleanor saw him and tried to wipe her face and smile, and that smile hurt him more than the tears had, and he said gently, "You don't have to pretend with me," and she hesitated, and then the words poured out, all the fears she had been carrying, All the things the town had said, all the doubts she had let grow in the dark. And Thomas listened, and as he listened, he realized that he had made a mistake not by loving her too little, but by not loving her loudly enough, not by failing to care, but by assuming she knew he did. And when she finished, she looked at him with red eyes and said, "I was supposed to be enough with being chosen once, but now I'm afraid I'm not enough to be chosen every day." And Thomas crossed the room and took her face in his hands, the same way he had on their wedding day, only now without hesitation, without uncertainty, and he said, "Eleanor, I choose you every morning when I wake up and you're here. I choose you every time I come home and you're waiting. I choose you when you're laughing and when you're afraid and when you're quiet. I didn't know how to say it before because I didn't know how to love like this, but I do love you." And Eleanor's breath caught at the word love because it was the first time it had been spoken between them, and it felt like a door opening that she had been afraid to knock on, and she whispered, "I love you too," and the fear that had been living between them lost its power in that moment, because fear cannot survive long in the presence of truth, and they held each other not in desperation but in certainty, and the town outside did not change, and the whispers did not stop, but something inside them had shifted, something strong and steady and resilient, something that no longer depended on the town's approval to exist, and from that day on they walked together through Hollow Creek, not with defiance but with quiet confidence, hands brushing, shoulders touching, a visible unity that made the town's judgments feel small and irrelevant, and Eleanor no longer tried to make herself smaller to survive, and Thomas no longer tried to make his love quiet to keep the peace, and they became together, something the town could not explain, a love that had not begun with fire but had grown into something that burned longer and brighter than fire ever could. Years later, when people spoke of Thomas Hale and Eleanor Gray, they no longer used the words forced or pity or old maid, because time has a way of rewriting stories when love outlives judgment, and the small farmhouse that once felt like a compromise became a home that felt like a promise, filled not with grand luxuries but with warmth, laughter, and the quiet evidence of a shared life. Eleanor's sewing basket by the window, Thomas's boots by the door, fresh bread on the table, flowers from the field, placed in simple jars not because they were expensive, but because they were beautiful, and Thomas often found himself watching Eleanor when she did not know he was looking, the way she hummed when she worked, the way she smiled at children who visited, the way she listened to others with the same patience she had once offered him, and he marveled at how completely she had woven herself into every corner of his existence, not as a possession but as a presence, and he realized that she was not merely his wife but his anchor, his calm, his courage, the place his heart returned to no matter how far the world tried to pull him away. And Eleanor in turn watched Thomas grow softer without growing weaker, watched him become a man who did not fear tenderness, who did not equate strength with silence, who allowed himself joy without apology, and she felt proud, not because she had changed him, but because he had chosen to grow, and together they became something rare, not perfect, not without conflict or sorrow or loss, but honest, resilient, alive. And when hardship came, as it always does, they faced it side by side. When crops failed, they planned together. When illness came, they tended each other. When grief visited, they held each other through it, and each trial did not weaken their bond but deepened it, like water carving stone into something smoother, something stronger. And the town, watching from the outside, slowly began to understand that what had begun as a transaction had become a devotion, and that Eleanor had not simply become Thomas's wife but his partner in every sense of the word, and that Thomas had not simply given Eleanor a place in his home but had given her a place in his heart that nothing else could ever occupy. And the children in the town grew up hearing not the story of the forced marriage, but the story of the unexpected love, the love that taught people that beginnings do not define endings, and that worth is not determined by when you are chosen but by how deeply you are cherished. And on a quiet evening, years after their wedding, Thomas and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills just as they had in their first year together, only now Eleanor leaned easily into Thomas's side, and Thomas wrapped his arm around her without thinking. And Eleanor said softly, "Do you ever think about how it started?" And Thomas smiled and replied, "Only to remind myself how lucky I am that it didn't end that way." And Eleanor laughed, that same light laugh that had once surprised them both, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and in that simple gesture lived everything they had built. Trust, love, history, hope, and Thomas thought, not for the first time, that being forced into this marriage had been the greatest gift of his life, not because he had been forced, but because fate had known something he had not, that Eleanor Gray, the woman the town had overlooked, was the woman who would become his everything. And Eleanor thought, not for the first time, that waiting all those years had not been a punishment but a preparation, because it had led her to a love that was not rushed, not fragile, not loud, but deep, enduring, and true.